So really, when I use the term genocidal aspects, genocidal features, I'm not exaggerating. They have ruined Iraq. Saddam's forces entered Kuwait in 1990, August 1990. From there on, Iraq was placed under the severest of sanctions. I remember I couldn't even send a letter to my family in Baghdad. Even if you want to send a pencil, this has to go through a sanctions regime in Iraq, because they said the lead bit in the pencil could be used as a military substance. So the sanctions were very severe, and those sanctions lasting 13 years, from end of 1990, beginning 1991, to the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, that's a good 13 years, these sanctions led to the death, according to the United Nations, of 500,000 Iraqi children, because they were so severe. Iraq was dependent on food supplies and of essentials, medical and so on. Unfortunately, despite its oil wealth, the regime did not have self-sufficiency in food or medical supplies and so on. So Iraqi children, Iraqi people suffered enormously. Madeleine Albright, who was permanent representative at the United Nations, who later also became U.S. Foreign Secretary, American Foreign Secretary, when she was asked, 500,000 Iraqi children have died through the sanctions, she replied, the price is worth it. Because the questioner told her, is the price worth it? She said, yes, the price is worth it. So the United States were fully aware of the genocidal impact of such sanctions. Sanctions are a form of war. They have, in the hands of the United States and Western powers, have become a very punishing, very severe form of war, because they lead to death. War leads to death and destruction. And these severe sanctions do lead to impoverishment, to deaths, to all manner of consequences harmful to local populations. The clearest example of what a siege type sanctions do is Gaza today. Israel has been putting Gaza under the severest of sanctions and forms of occupation since 1967, because they occupied Gaza in 1967. Most of the population of Gaza, by the way, overwhelming majority, are either refugees, Palestinian refugees from Palestine, or the descendants of those refugees, refugees of 1948 and refugees of 1967 war in Gaza. And these sanctions, starvation methods, and so on, kill people endlessly. And in Iraq, they killed 500,000 Iraqi children. I really struggle to find a case where NATO has genuinely intervened to defend human rights, to establish proper peace, and so on, or to defend peace. On the contrary, their practice is quite disturbing in terms of the violence they cause, the death and destruction. 2003, they invade and occupy Iraq. And over 1 million Iraqis died within a short period of 5 to 6 years after the occupation of Iraq. Up to 1 million people. And this is well researched by a US medical team. Their data was published in the Lancet medical journal. They estimated at the time of publishing their research up to 650,000 Iraqis. By extrapolating their same method, it was well over 1 million by 2006-7. So really, this is a form of genocidal war leading to all manner of consequences. During the war, both the war in 1991, after the invasion of Kuwait, and the invasion occupation of Iraq in 2003, the United States and its allies used depleted uranium ammunition. Tens of thousands of these munitions were used across Iraq. And they led to a massive rise in cancer incidents, horrific forms of cancers, birth defects, and the so-called half-life time of depleted uranium is well over 1,000 years. So the poison of the Iraqi land and water is continuing. The United States and its NATO allies are not taking responsibility for clearing the lands of Iraq from the depleted uranium munition they have used. It's a form of WMD, a form of weapon of mass destruction, really. They call it just munition to penetrate heavy steel of tanks and so on. But really, they continue to release radiation into the environment over hundreds of years. So really, when I use the term genocidal aspects, genocidal features, I'm not exaggerating. They have ruined Iraq. The health system in Iraq was quite a good health system because some of the oil money was spent on health, despite the fact that I think Iraq could have become a very well-developed country and so on. I blame the regime and Western influence in Iraq. But at least in a minimal sense, there was a good health service, good basic educational service. Women had rights that they fought for 50, 60, 100 years. All these were semi-destroyed. So when you look at Iraq today, the footprints of U.S. led interventions in Iraq, the fight against the Iraqi people has been quite monumental and very damaging to the Iraqi people on all fronts. I mean, I was in Iraq in the summer, last summer, and really you go around Iraq, you see these new high-rise buildings and some highway roads and so on, newly built. But really, when you dig deeper, you'll see the enormous disparity in wealth that has appeared, with multi-billionaires emerging alongside severe poverty and a deteriorating health service, educational service, privatization. You probably heard of Paul Bremer. Paul Bremer ruled Iraq after the 2003 occupation. He was the official ruler of Iraq appointed by the occupation forces. He listed 350 state establishments in Iraq. He published them on the website, on the so-called Iraqi Provisional Government website that he led. 350 establishments, industrial and agricultural establishments, all state-owned. And they ran hundreds of agricultural and industrial establishments. And he created 3 columns. So he listed the 350 and the 3 columns were headed close down, mothball, and sell. So destroyed the entire base of the Iraqi state's control over agriculture and industry, quite consciously, quite deliberately, because they wanted to create a so-called neocon heaven for the transnational companies and corporate capital to control Iraq and suck out its wealth and exploit its people. So really, the destruction is quite widespread. Political, economic, human rights level, on all levels. The impact of US-led interventions in Iraq have been quite horrific for the Iraqi people. NATO has never been a defensive force, really. It's been a combative interventionist force. And their role in the world has been a negative one as far as peace and security of the world peoples is concerned. So really, abolishing NATO is going to become a huge advance for world peace, because the Warsaw Pact, which was a military pact led by the Soviet Union in opposition to NATO throughout the Cold War years, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, just before the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, because the United States promised that NATO will not expand and so on, will freeze. And people talked about the dividend of peace and so on. So instead of dissolving NATO, or at least restricting it, they expanded NATO. creating a huge threat to world peace. NATO has never been a defensive force, really. It's been a combative interventionist force. And their role in the world has been a negative one as far as peace and security of the world peoples is concerned. So, really, abolishing NATO is going to become a huge advance for world peace because the Warsaw Pact, which was a military pact led by the Soviet Union in opposition to NATO throughout the Cold War years, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, just before the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, because United States promised that NATO will not expand and so on, will freeze. And people talked about the dividend of peace and so on. So instead of dissolving NATO, or at least restricting it, they expanded NATO, creating a huge threat to world peace.